Around. There we go. Okay. So debating on the motion, this houses the LGBTQ plus movement in a developing country would focus its queer tourism initiatives towards local indigenous forms of queerness, calling on the Prime Minister to start the debate here.
Hello. Can I be heard?
Loud and clear, and you are visible as well.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't hear you because the audio of my partner is not there. Okay, starting my speech in a while. But guys, through chat, yeah, I'll be recording my speech. So if ever you will raise a POI, it may be captured in the recording. So yeah, starting in 3, 2, one. When you prioritize the mainstream queers in Thailand, you necessarily diminish the Kathoey, who have significantly less focus already at status quo. Queers are already vulnerable inherently. Not pushing for this policy necessarily exacerbates the vulnerability because indigenous, geographically insular communities are vulnerable all the more. I want to frame this debate in a couple of ways. First, what does the queer community look like in the developing context? We have to note that there is a spectrum of acceptance of queer individuals in these developing countries. You have states like Thailand and Vietnam that are very accepting of the LGBT because you have progressive pro-queer forces like Prime Minister Shinawatra, who declared support for queer rights in Thailand. And this also looks like Vietnamese leaders expressing the Communist Party support for queer people because they think it is in line with their principles. At worst, though, you have states like the Philippines that are so entrenched in anti-queer sentiments due to the religious pushback from the Catholic Church. But even in these cases, where the developing country isn't as accepting, the common ground is that they remain entrenched in Western dominance. What makes Thailand and the Philippines the same is that both have been oppressed by the West, and forwarding their indigenous narratives, especially in a community as crucial as the queers, is necessary on both sides of the spectrum. Note that we are engaging on a multiplicity of frames as to what this developing country necessarily looks like. On both sides, you still have safe spaces. And while there is a spectrum of acceptance, there is still a level of political pushback from certain countries. These are people who are direct victims of colonization. So whatever came from the West is framed as negative, which is why people subscribe to this rhetoric in the first place. What exactly now is the interest of the queer community? First, they want political buy-in, and secondly, they want to prioritize external tourism because the LGBT wants to gain revenue so people can recognize their plights and problems. They need people on the ground to accept them. What do the comparatives of queer tourism generally look like then? In Gob's world, we give our limited capital and resources in developing the underrepresented parts of the LGBT community to have more exposure. We set up a fund and businesses on these areas and allow the queer community here to have bigger audiences as a result. In opposition, exclusively, you have to opt into the mainstream model of developing tourism culture, which is based upon Western precedents, where you generally set it up in urban places and are much more accustomed to the norms it originates from, which is the West. So the trade-off is simple. We are okay with not following the blueprint of queer tourism and give up some of the traditional buy-in opposition will have if it means we have a much more nuanced version of the movement on Go. Our standards are simple. What does the LGBT movement in a developing country want, and how must we weigh on this debate? One, they want to forward their identity as the queer community in the context of a developing nation. This is true because one of the key tenets of the queer community is about highlighting the struggle and the identity attached to it. This is the reason why people who are victims of intersectional bigotry would like to highlight all these nuances in their life. Why is it so important then to take note of this standard? First, because these are so proximate and unique things that matter most to the queer community. And secondly, because of the lived experiences that make it so important to these queer people to highlight the specific struggles that they have. Two, then, second standard, they also want public buy-in and recognition, which is important to them because they want to push for greater acceptance within the public so that they can push for their advocacies more. And while we do trade off the traditional buy-in mechanisms opposition has, we think that our nuanced setting of queer tourism would be better on net. I want to argue two things. We mitigate first the anti-West rhetoric and we prove why this is a moral obligation. Argument one, this is the way to both mitigate anti-West rhetoric, increasing buy-in, and achieve the goal of greater genuine representation. These indigenous identities are pre-colonial in nature, which means that they've existed long before being occupied by the West. It looks like Babaylans who have proliferated as crucial officers in barangays long before the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, like the Chakras and Hijras that have persisted across multiple centuries prior to British invasion of India. These are identities that are inherent to a nation in the first place. The problem now is that the optics to them has been marred because of Western push on queers. Most of the reception on queers being abhorred by conservative bases was due to criticism on Western liberalism. It was directed to queer people where we get a massive conservative push from North Carolina, which is why the queer movement was born in the first place as a consolidation of the West to support their queer people. But in status quo, indigenous queers are subjected to the same standards by their communities. They face the same criticism by religious bigots, but they are yet to enjoy the same benefits as your Western queer counterparts because there has yet to be a policy in Thailand that actively recognizes the Kathoey, even when queers in general have been accepted because there is no focus on indigenous identities entirely. But let's be engaging here. I want to discuss the comparative. On Gov, you allow the moderates to be convinced because you are able to tap into the national identity of Asian countries because the state itself actively advocates for these unique identities among the minority queer identities. So in Gov exclusively, people can resonate more with the values of the queer community across the entirety of its spectrum because you don't have an excessive focus on the Western-dominated queer narratives to take precedence. This means creating indigenous narratives can become the norm of your country. Get to tap into the national identity. You look back to the pre-colonial past, especially in the context of intersectionality, which is preferable because now you get a critical mass because people are willing to listen. And sure, we agree that some people will necessarily be bigoted conservatives on both sides, but we cater to the moderates who are more likely the people who need to be affected anyway. There's a need to prioritize the people who have these unique identities because at status quo, people are alienating them already. It's high time that they become protected as well. Identities that are already mainstream, like being gay or bisexual, remain accepted already to some degree. And when you prioritize these indigenous identities, you focus on the nuances that alienate them and necessarily allow them to get traction on the wider public. Comparative then, before I get the POI, gay people already have the rise of progressiveness to support them at least to some extent. But the identities of the chakras, for example, remain eliminated. Impacts. First, you get a better national identity because you integrate the indigenous identities within these queer communities that have been excluded for far too long. Second, you prevent the erasure of these indigenous people. And third, it is just better
Mandatory
economic.
POI.
Yeah, so like what do you think is the initial reaction of, like, say, outsiders from urban areas or Westerners towards manifestations of culture that are niche?
Yeah, Up will probably say that these identities will no longer be representative on national identity, but we already preempt this right now. I have 3 levels to prove this. Thank you so much for your PI. One, their population simply has less quantity. So obviously they are just less people by number. So there are less people who will support them. So obviously people from the US do not know the chakras in India because they probably have less traction in the first place. Second, they're geographically insular to the people. You have the Hijras in India that's far from Mumbai. So obviously their traction is restricted. Because these people are already questioned at status quo, you need to empower them in order for them to be heard, which looks like the state actually sponsoring policies that advocate for Babaylans in Bicol, even when they are vastly different from the Western-dominated subculture of the capital. The comparative is, on all these people will be left behind if there is no focus on them, then status quo will stand. They are already seen very badly at status quo. We want to change that. On our side, it will be more accessible, like how provincial biases will come into play, and second, you allow them to see them more. Argument 2. This is a moral obligation on intersectionality to these indigenous people. Neoliberal education has overshadowed the indigenous identity, and we achieve this better because we cater to an intersectional set of actors. We give them more buy-in, but note how we co-opt the impacts on tourism by virtue of this, because their access to tourism is also intersectional. We lose the bias, we get the benefits of tourism as a whole. Propose. Thanks so much.
Thank you, PM. And to present the case coming from Up, calling on LO. Here.
Hello, hold on a second. Okay, I'll just get my time. All right, so I'm Trickster, POIs we chat exclusively. I'll be looking at the chat box. Wait, hold on. Excuse me. Okay, no preferred gender pronoun also. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In many countries, including Philippines and Thailand, indigenous forms of queerness embody rich and complex cultural traditions that are not always fully understood even by local populations. This lack of comprehensive understanding often results in the misrepresentation and exploitation of these traditions, these cultures, and these symbols, for example, particularly in the context of understanding queer experience on the context of marketing and tourism in the first place. Very, very proud to oppose in this debate. Our stance here is simple. We think that it's fundamentally more ideal to create a diverse and decentralized form of tourism. That is to say that it's not just centered on specific local and indigenous forms of queerness in tourism, that we think is fundamentally disrespectful towards these specific cultures in the first place. We think that as alternative, the way we can do is we can highlight common experience, for example, of queers in general and experiences you can get without necessarily having to focus and fetishize these kinds of cultures in the first place. If you want experiences, we think that there are many alternatives. Talk about drag and pageant competitions in barangays, included in many tourist programs, for example, that we think ultimately is more beneficial and is not harmful in any way. Responses. Firstly, they said it's going to provide more nuanced representation in connection to national identity. Two levels of responses to this. Firstly, this is wrong. The queer community is diverse even before, which means that not all people are rooted in things like Babaylan, for example. So the question then is, how do you exactly track the people that stem from these specific indigenous culture and necessarily empower them in the first place? That's something that Gov has to prove and has to clarify in this debate. But secondly, we even say that identity evolves over time, which means that some identity may grow apart from being recognized or connected with historical view of their ancestors, for example, which ultimately precedes why it's very important for us to establish this common and national identity without acknowledging that these different experiences and these different niche can exist in the first place. We think, and this is just an acknowledgement, right? Like, look, you're not fundamentally going to remove things like Babaylan, for example. These things will still exist as it's part of history. But we do not think that this should be the driving force for tourism. And I'm going to explain later why this is fundamentally harmful. The fundamental flaw of Gov is that their assumption is that tourism automatically equates and leads to education and highlighting their history and empowering their voices, when in reality, tourism literally just focus on marketing. It literally focus on exploiting these specific cultures. For example, talk about Wang Od, for instance. So that's something that government has to take as trade-off as well. Why are they okay with these cultures being exploited at the expense that they're going to empower these specific things rather than having different types of alternatives? Three arguments for you in the debate. Firstly, I'll talk about strategic essentialism and why this is fundamentally harmful. Second, I'll talk about why this is bad in international local tourism, especially if PM conceded that it's important for the movement to gain money, for example. But thirdly, I'm going to talk about why the decentralized form of tourism is fundamentally better for tourism for the queer movement. So in the context of queer tourism, focusing on local and indigenous forms of queerness is seen as a way to create a distinct and appealing identity for marketing purposes. This approach can overlook the diversity and complexity within these communities, for example. In some tourist destinations like Thailand, for example, local performances or rituals are adapted to cater to tourist preferences that ultimately dilute the cultural authenticity, especially given that they are very vulnerable as characterized by Prime Minister. This adaptation leads to a form of cultural appropriation where the original meaning of these practices fundamentally lost or altered given the uses of it. We think that queer movement initiatives that intentionally highlight and market local and indigenous queer practices as unique selling point lead to creation of themed tours, events, or experiences that emphasize these aspects to attract LGBTQ travelers seeking authentic and culturally significant experience that leads to commodification of these practices, reducing them to mere tourist attraction. Before I proceed, sure, POI.
So you think that it's worse of a harm that we misrepresent Wang Od sometimes, but we can somehow correct it rather than, not know about Mambabatoks at all because there's actually no representation before that.
I literally just stated in my speech that this is not going to be erased because this is still part of the Philippines regardless. But what we think is that this should not be the center of tourist attractions. Second argument, why it's going to be bad in international and even local tourism. Focusing on local and indigenous queer identities in tourism creates a distorted representation of these cultures, given that it's incredibly hard to comprehend right away to represent these cultures. Hence why even up to now, anthropologists are still constantly studying about Babaylan, for example. These practices often lead to misrepresentation of local and indigenous cultures, perpetuating stereotypes or misunderstanding, especially among tourists. It may place under pressure local communities to perform or adapt these cultural practices to meet tourist expectations. That is to say that you expect every single queer Filipino people to know about Babaylan, for example. This misalignment can cause harm by reinforcing exoticism and reducing rich, diverse tradition to simplistic tourist attraction. We think that this is fundamentally harmful, especially focusing on niche market ultimately limits the potential tourist base, reducing overall economic impact compared to broader tourism approaches. This is bad because it narrower a focus that reduces visibility and support for the broader LGBTQ movement, limiting opportunities to raise awareness and promoting inclusivity on a wider scale. This is going to happen because of two reasons. Firstly, when you target smaller audience, the overall revenue generated from tourism ultimately is going to be lower compared to a broader approach that attracts a wide range of visitors that can feel like they are included, that is not centered on one specific identity, that does not represent the entire diverse culture and set of identities that queer people have. But secondly, businesses may be less inclined to invest in infrastructures and services if the market is going to perceive as significantly limited, potentially stunting growth and development, which directly responds to PM's discussion about how we want to be able to prioritize businesses and gain profit for the movement in the first place. On our world, when you decentralize these tourist attractions, for example, you can exclusively focus on different kinds of tourisms that adapt to a more inclusive approach by supporting a variety of queer artists, for example, and cultural expressions from across the globe. This can be achieved by promoting a range of experiences and cultural contributions rather than highlighting a single, possibly misrepresented form of queerness. We think that decentralizing art allows for richer and more nuanced appreciation of diverse queer identities and cultural practices, and this approach fosters mutual respect and understanding while also supporting the global queer community in a more holistic and inclusive manner. Thanks.
Thank you so much. LO to extend the case coming from Gov calling on BPM. Here.
Wait.
Mas madaling maintindihan. Tas mas diverse.
Hello. I'll just get my, oh, hi. Yeah, I'll just get my timer. Can I borrow your timer since this is 5%?
Sure.
Actually, I need to charge this right now. I'm so sorry. It's 5%. I'm not lying. Yeah. Wait, sorry. I'll just charge this because I'm using hotspot, so my apologies. Before I confirm, before I start, can I just make sure that I'm audible and visible?
You are audible, you are not visible. There you are.
What?
You're in the other device.
Yeah, different
Yeah.
device.
Yeah. Yes to both.
Thank you. Before I start, my POI preferences are on the chat. So kindly please do not badger me since I really don't like people badgering me since it ruins the flow. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1, and go. There are two clashes. First, where do we protect the indigenous queer identity? Second, where is tourism better off? First issue then, where do we protect the indigenous queer identity? What did they say? They say that we're going to exploit the cultural identity of these individuals because that is the nature of marketing. No mechanism at all on how that is likely to be problematic in nature. So they need to provide us the step-by-step mechanism on why this is likely to be negative in the first place. So therefore, their core premise within this argument is to say that this is likely to be done well. This is likely to be done badly, and it's likely to be done maliciously. If I am able to take down that premise, therefore none of their impacts manifest within the debate. Therefore, why is this insufficient for them to prove within the debate? The first thing that I want to ask is that who will do this tourism and who will advocate for it? Obviously, it's the LGBT movement on both sides of the house. So therefore, these types of entities are still likely to be rational because they are the victim of oppression. So therefore, they still have some level of relatability and understanding that these types of identities are something that is sensitive in nature, which is why we shouldn't play around it. But secondly, I want to parallel this to dark tourism, because even if there are tourism that features a lot of very dark events, we don't necessarily say that, oh, we should go there and celebrate. Obviously, the mood of it is completely different because these types of entities know that in order to generate more awareness, more interest from other individuals, you need to make it in a way that is similar to the place that you are going into, which is why there's an active incentive in order to ensure that it's likely to be done well, because they don't want to have any backlash at all. And this is where I want to prove the second mechanism on why marketing in itself are too risk averse in order to do it badly, which therefore responds to leaders of opposition. Firstly, the fact that there's a rational entity means that they do proper research, means that they have a lot of information, for example, because they have access to books, for example, which means that they are able to do this very well. But secondly, the fact that they conceded that people are being cancelled for exploiting other means that is a precedent in order to be careful, because the fact that you know that exploiting other cultures are already being scrutinized in status quo, obviously you won't do that because you're already aware of these kinds of instances, because the fact that the cancel culture is already strong in status quo, which is why the rise of progressivism, people calling you out in Twitter, is something that is likely to be effective, because your incentive and your capacity to have more money is dependent on whether people trust you and depends on your optics. So therefore, the fact that you need to have public buy-in means that you are likely to do this very well, because you cannot afford any backlash at all, because that ruins your perception within the public consciousness, because you need more people to opt in, and that is the only way to do that is because the only way for you to do that is when you are able to ensure that this is likely to be done well. So therefore, all of their impacts right now already falls flat. Second issue, therefore, where is tourism better off? What did they say? They say that it's too complex. The foreigners won't understand it. Firstly, I want to frame it right, because on both sides of the house, this type of indigenous culture will exist on both sides of the house. This is where we pointed out that this indigenous culture are being endangered already because of the strongman rhetoric, for example, that are coming from conservatism, for example, because they frame LGBT as part of the West, for example, because it is something that came from the democracy and things like that. So therefore, the fact that we have negative association affiliated with these queer identities means that we need to have a solution on how we are able to protect them. Their solution here is to simply make it unknown, make it to ignore it on the public consciousness, because you don't want to have that focus. And this is terrible, because you are likely to get more apathetic people under their comparative, because these types of individuals will never know it, because they are geographically away from these types of individuals. So therefore, the comparative here is better, because even if it's too complex, you are able to make it in a way that is still palatable, because these types of individuals are still rational. They are able to report it in a way that is understandable across all individuals, because they need that public buy-in. The second thing that they say is that we need to be diverse in order to attract more people. Firstly, we have been doing this for the long time, but the problem is that you are no longer unique if you do this right now, because you are a basic bitch, because everyone else is doing it. This is why developing nations are able to easily outcompete you, because they have more resources, they have more infrastructure. So therefore, given that given their alternative is easily accessible by everyone, because everyone can do it, therefore means that you don't get a lot of people there, because these people are likely to go to more developed nations like Japan, for example, and Taiwan. Why would they go to the Philippines if other places are way nicer? The comparative is this, because you are able to have unique identities, means that this is your unique selling point. This is your comparative advantage. This is something that is not basic. This is something irreplaceable and truly yours. So therefore, that is how you're able to tap to people, because they only want to go to places that they haven't visited yet. So therefore, these people are not bored, but they are bored under the world of opposition. The last thing that they say is that you don't get any investment. No, right? Because we prove that people will care about this, which means that these types of entities will still invest, because the LGBT movement exists on both sides. But the fact that this correlates to your national identity means that you are able to get domestic investors, for example. So therefore, all of their impacts already falls. POI, go ahead now. Which form of tourism attracts more queer extensions? Which form of tourism is better? Frame is that who are the people that we are likely to get under opposition, under government bench? There are two types of individuals. First, demographic. We are able to get rich queer tourists to enter on our side, because these are individuals who are only interested in places that they haven't been exposed to yet. That is to say, given that these are rich to queer tourists, they have all of the money in the world, which means that they were probably already tired of the usual and mainstream LGBT tourists, which therefore means that they lack interest on the counterfactual of opposition. Why then this is true? Simple. Diminishing marginal utility means that the more that you consume something, the less the value it is to you. Given that the norm, given that the norm in the past is already the mainstream traditional queer LGBT spaces like Taiwan and Japan, this type of entities are already probably bored of those kinds of places because they have already explored every part of it. The comparative is better because you tap to the interest of these rich individuals, which means that you attract them more to go to these developing nations, and you are able to reignite the domestic market because you are able to have more exchange goods and services, because the purchasing power of these individuals are high, which therefore you benefit the local people on the ground because they're able to sell their own products, for example, and things like that. Why then is this true? Firstly, the level of exposure is minimal. Given that these concepts are unknown and seem interesting, you make people curious. It is something that is unique. It is something that is distinct, which means that rich people are only attracted to something that is new and into something that they haven't know yet. But secondly, the way how this indigenous tourism are being branded, I think that you're likely to highlight the unique distinction of this indigenous culture. So therefore, the comparison of difference is very clear. The form of marketing is likely to hook more people because they have the incentive to attract more people, and they have the tools to necessarily ensure that these people will be attracted because they have a lot of marketing interns and things like that. So therefore, the impact of this is quite simple. You are able to get more people under orange of the house because this is something unique. This is not something basic. So therefore, that trickles down to the people that are indigenous within that area because you are able to educate yourself. You are able to buy their goods and services, which means that these people are able to penetrate the mainstream visibility of the public consciousness because you don't leave these people in the dark, especially considering that these types of entities are being harmed in status quo.
Thank you, DPM. And to extend the case coming from up bench calling on Dela. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. And you are
Okay.
visible.
Thanks so much. Okay, I hope I can condense this. But anyway, few eyes via voice. I promise I'm gonna take one because obviously we're obligated to do so. So just like raise once and I'll call you, but preferably like raise that within the 5 minute and 30 seconds mark. Again, please raise that in the 5 minute and 30 seconds mark. Please, please, please. Okay. Gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The government makes two fundamental errors in their round. Their first error is their lack of meaningful engagement against our first speaker. In LO's speech, we argued a strategic essentialism and the inherent exploitative nature of tourism because of commercial and pernicious predetermined design. The only response that we heard from them is that the movement is rational, so even if they will use this pernicious tourism, they can circumvent this issue as well. Note that these are insufficient to take down our case because it does not disprove first why the movement can unilaterally circumvent these structures that they also operate in. So even if they are rational, the fact that advertising is inherently bad suggests that they are forced to navigate on the same nature of advertising. Second, why marketing as to how it is perceived and like received by the general masses gets to also be changed. Because even if your intention to use tourism is to culturally help the people, how people receive it is still pegged on its pernicious origins, such as how people just go to tourist attractions to share Instagrammable pics or release exotic TikTok reels. This is literally me. Third, why people respond to the same level of understanding that you ultimately want or peg your case upon. I think that there's no analysis as to why people are automatically going to feel inclined to believe what they wanted you to believe just because you supported or created or instigated a particular tourism from the onset. This failure to meaningfully respond to us suggests that our case ultimately still remains undisputed. Their second flaw is their cracks in their argument. The summary of what they argued is that the interest of the movement is political buy-in and advancing the underrepresented sectors. 3 levels of responses. 1, this is an inconsistency. If PM argues that their vote in their side is already operating in a gender positive context, like those in Thailand and Indonesia, then the actual goal of the movement is not political buy-in and support at this point, rather a more personal and community-centric goal such as feelings of inclusivity and deterring the potential effects of infighting should be focused on specific form of struggle or queer identities. This is likely to be true because the movement at this point in time are being derailed by the existence of internal divisions. In fact, they have the moral obligation to support and prioritize the struggles of the members of the movement over getting buy-in from like potentially non-members of the movement or foreigners. Remember that the community is indebted first and foremost to its members. In both sides, they are willing to sacrifice some members of the movement, not not being able to relate or being able to relate or feel a sense of community. So just they can focus on like niche indigenous cultures to get political demand and political buy-in. Two, it's unsure that they get acceptance if for the underrepresented. In fact, there will likely be backlash and infighting because of the fact that you set a premium to specific identities and cultures that are niche and not everyone can relate to. Note that if you come from the Philippines, you yourself cannot fully understand the indigenous culture. This is worse should you come from the West who cannot understand the nuances and context of these cultures alone. So acceptance is unlikely in their side as well because of the barriers to understanding the specific local queerness, like a lack of epistemic knowledge and relatability. But three, even if this is true that you get political buy-in and acceptance, this is better in our side because we decentralize empowerment and support to a common understanding of the gay culture. This is better because the queer community is able to assert where they relate, feel greater empathy, and create more meaningful discourse and relationships. The extension that DPM suggests is that you would learn from these cultures because it's enticing for you because it's new. This is not mutually exclusive because obviously, should you want to go to Japan, for example, it's because you have existing knowledge about Japan or have an innate information about them. Like, why the hell would you go to somewhere without you not having any prior knowledge about it? B, even if it's true, there is natural incentive for you to research about this space because you simply want to be safe and secured. So the new information that you get from this is not marginally significant. But apart from these two, I contend that the case is not really about comparative advantage or tourism alone, especially if tourism in itself comes at the expense of local identities. The next thing I'll do is just extend on why niche localized queer tourism in government derails the advocacy of the subaltern gay movement because it exposes them to Orientalism and appropriation. First, the goal of the subaltern movement is to reject and redirect the salient Western portrayal and description of local queer communities, which we both agree. Second, it is to allow the subaltern queer community to control the dialectical narratives between the West and like developing countries. This leads me to the premise of this extension, and that the gay movement from subaltern nations like those in the Philippines and those in localized developing nations are susceptible to structural issues like Orientalism and reappropriation because of the inherent nature of foreigners and the Western culture that looks down upon local identities and culture that hinges on their unique yet exotic experiences outside Europe. This looks like, one, the hypersexual perception of Europeans to like ladyboys in Thailand, two, the fatalistic perception of like European countries like France and Germany to like the increasing like number of STD cases in like specific developing nations. I argue that these two are bad because the Orientalist perception of the West oversimplifies our cultural nuances and context that creates hegemonic perception about our lived realities that creates sub-descriptions of who we are and what we really actually do based on the perception of stereotypical and like descriptive portrayals of our culture as subalterns in the perspective of the West. Note that this directly responds to the case of BM on derailing the Western perspective because the very nature of tourism in fact towards the gaze of the West. I argue that Western hegemony will exist regardless and Gov cannot take this clash simply because efforts to decolonize is forcibly clashing with neocolonialism that is stronger because of the widespread globalization and the need for transnational interactions. More so, importantly, I argue that the case of decoloniality in their side is also something that was started and originated from the perspective of the Westerners. Various social science scholars reject the need to decolonize simply because our acculturated identities like the common and shared experiences of the gay people have already been adapted and reclaimed by subaltern cultures. In fact, decoloniality is a paradigm that was instigated by Western scholars. This means that there is no need to localize gay experience because our shared experiences, even from those of the West, imposition are things that we feel validly and are actually authentically representative of ourselves. POI.
So, Hijras are being cracked down in status quo since they are perceived as weird by strongman leaders. Given the movement cares about intersectionality, how do you safeguard this type of individuals if you leave them be, since this debate exists in a spectrum of cases?
But you don't actually help them because you just like empower these people to fetishize, to orientalize these perceptions. Note that this oriental perception is also usually the cause of attempts to reappropriate and indignify the culture of these local people because Westerners usually fetishize or ecositize our culture for their personal gratification and creating a dialectical tension between us, the ones who are being observed by their gaze, and them, the West, who are gazing at us. This is bad in the context of localized queer cultures because because it ultimately like creates an exclusive affordance and control to the narrative of the Western counterparts. Specifically, first, you give them the opportunity to orientalize us because we focus on the existence of a niche indigenous culture in our side that subconsciously gets to be perceived and like described by them as well. But second, you give them the avenue to validate and verify their orientalist gaze that presupposes the effects of objectification and fragmentation of sensibilities of the community. But third, you allow them to share meaningful space of the local communities that is pegged on their obscured and oppressive ideals of what it is about and for who it is. These are bad because of two reasons. A, you allow greater levels of misinterpretation of localized settings and queer identities for the entertainment of the Western gazers. B, you generate a cultural tension that privileges the Oriental perception and accentuates the issues of cultural stereotypes in the portrayal spec on the Western perspective. These are bad implications, ultimately and exclusive to queer indigenous local tourism, because tourism is innately appeasing to the international audience whose subconscious worldviews and positionalities are anchored on fetishized and exoticized understanding, but more so because tourism is inherently edges on post-experience interpretation of foreigners about their overall experience. Clearly,
Thank you, DLO, to end the substantive portion of GovBench, calling on GovRip. Here.
All right. Okay. POIs through voice? Yeah. Because I don't want to be interrupted by mandatory POI. Actually, wait, sorry, through chat. Sorry. Through chat. Starting in Q. 3, 2, 1, go. The fact that Oboy and leader of opposition talks about the problems of like fetishizing these types of things is already showing reversibility in it of itself. Few months ago, we didn't know who Wang. Few years ago, we didn't know who Wang Od was. Now we can talk about why it's bad that we fetishize it and we simplify it. The point here is simple. The entire case of leader opposition and deputy leader opposition hinges on the fact that it is bad, that it will be oversimplified, and therefore we should reject it in its totality. We think that it's too simplistic of a case, and there are just multiple ways that you can circumvent that harm because the benefits are just far too better off. We think government bench is the only team that deals with the two important standards that we have asserted and rightfully justify in this debate. One, how do you get proper buy-in? But more importantly, two, whereas we as the LGBTQ movement highlight our form of intersectionality because this is how we express our lived and unique struggles being a part of the minority, being under the curse of intersectionality of bigotry. Two main issues. Firstly, on the point of tourism, and is it going to be good? Firstly, the entire case of leader opposition is to say that marketing is what makes this bad because there's just multiple structural reasons why marketing makes it bad. And then secondly, Alboy talks about why culturally it's going to be bad, and both of them lead to the same conclusion, that eventually it will be misrepresented. 4 key responses. First, we already told you that these are rational actors, therefore it's unlikely to be that bad as they say. They never deal with this to the extent. They only say that they can circumvent it because marketing, but these individuals already know it to begin with. The fact that you and me know it, it means probably people who will fund and support these things to begin with, who invest time and a lot of money to begin with, would want to make this good to begin with. They don't want to defile these types of things to begin with, and therefore it is unlikely that they're going to act in such nefarious ways, given that, people who fund queer tourism are probably queer people who understand the struggles of being part of the minority on the intersectionality. So one, it's not as bad. Second, it's uncomparative on their side, right? So the thing is, exploitation will happen on both sides of the house. June already gave you a very clear comparison that even in the best case, by the way, we're the only team debating on the spectrum here, where even if it's in Thailand where queer people are accepted, the minority queer people in Thailand still don't get any representation at all coming from their prime minister. So in the best case, these people are just completely erased. Just don't buy the case of LO with the assertion to say that they will not be erased. Yes, maybe you won't actively and willfully erase them, but if people don't talk about them enough, nobody knew Wang within the past few years at the end of the day. So the harms still exist on both sides, but we're the only one to try to give the solvency. But 3, and here's the engagement that I already gave for my POI at leader of all. We told you that there's reversibility at the end of the day. So let's think about the best harm that they can give us. We say that they fetishize us, they say that they simplify us. The mere fact that you and me are already talking about this, the mere fact that people are raging about the simplification, oversimplification, and the commodification of Wang to begin with, most likely means that there's a self-correcting mechanism in the case that marketing becomes bad to begin with. And that is, by the way, assuming that these marketers are not afraid of the backlash, which is why they would try to avoid this to begin with. But even if we reach the main point, right, let's give opposition what they want at the end of the day. There's reversibility at this point in time. Comparatively on their side, when you are forgotten, when you are not being talked about, and when you're being discriminated, there may be no active incentive to erase you, but there's a passive flow of the LGBT community to not highlight them and just invest in other things because marketing, right? that is a principled damage and a pragmatic letting go of these people into oblivion because there's no other actor that would be able to highlight them since they are probably the only ones that can able to help them. The fourth response is that even if, right, there is still some sort of harms that would happen, even because there's reversibility, we think that June framed it very good at Prime Minister, that there are economic benefits to begin with at the end of the day. So if in both sides there will be harm to begin with, one is that you're going to be forgotten at the end of the day because opposition simply cannot assert that they would do it as well because we already framed that you have limited capital to begin with. They never rejected this frame, which means they have to assert the frame that on their side, they will be very limited to no representation for these people. At the very least, on our side, we give the economic ability for these people to set up businesses for themselves and to forward their either own goals or their own careers. This is something that is very rarely given to queer individuals, especially in indigenous setting. And we think that these four responses take down the entire opposition case as a whole. Before I move on as to what we said in tourism, I'll take a few why.
There are many different avenues to bring this into discussion, i.e. in the academic and social discussions, and validating your point of like completely forgetting them. Why do you think traveling and exploiting their culture is fundamentally the most successful way to do this?
Like, if you actually have a raise of hands here, an honest raise of hands, who knew Wang Od 2 years ago? Like maybe some of you because you guys are really smart, but the point is for the general majority, they probably don't know them as well. I probably believe Allboy, but because he's Allboy, he's special and he's probably brilliant and he cares about these things. But for majority of the people, they probably don't. And that's the main case line that we're going for here, right? There's a reversibility at least on our side. We told you why it's strategic path on our side and why we beat the anti-West sentiment. The only thing that deals with the section of anti-West and the feeling of being in the marginalized developing community. We're the only one to fulfill that standard. What is the response? They say backlash. But again, that is reversible. At the very least, even if we fail, right, the main fact that these community of queer people in the minority setting of developing nations tried to begin with is a justified and something of a noble pursuit in of itself. Something that you have to credit government bench. But secondly, we also talked about why there's a unique selling point on our side. What is the only response coming from deputy? They say that they're not gonna know to begin with. Two responses to this, right? People who go for queer tourism to begin with, especially if they're coming from the West, means that these are queer individuals who probably are interested to go into queer places to begin with. Which means if they're interested, they're more likely going to research, which means that this is the unique selling point that will be seen. But secondly, what is the solvency on their side? If we're gonna have the follow the blueprint and say that, okay, maybe they know the Philippines has this sort of queer tourism, why would they pick the Philippines over Japan? There's literally no solvency as to how the queer communities from developing countries have the edge on their side. We told you from Abid why there's a unique selling point on our side. So maybe, yes, it's not the perfect solution, but at least there's an edge that we create. Comparative on your side, not really something. Lastly, on principle, right, on the issue principle. They only argued for principled purity as to why you should never ever touch it and prove it wrong. On our side, we prove national identity and intersectionality should be highlighted, even if it comes at the cost of some flaws. And the main reason being is that our side, again, has a self-correcting mechanism for these individuals and at the very least provides capital to these people, both social and economic. On their side, they don't get anything at the end of the day. If you're going to ask the people of Bangkok whether or not, it gave them much more revenue and much more opportunity for life, that's what matters most. And this is a government.
Thank you, Gobwit. To close the substantive portion of Upbench, calling on Upwit. Here.
Hi, confirming that I'm audible and visible.
Yes to both.
All right, last round. Yes, work. POIs through voice. Just don't badger. Yes. Niel, look for her gender products. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Despite first glances, queer people are not immune to the crimes of appropriation, exoticizing, and othering that plagues the world at large. Crimes that are made more possible in government's proposal. We oppose. I only have one overarching issue, and like all of my responses are in here, right? Is it justified for the LGBTQ plus movement to focus its queer tourism initiatives towards particular specific cultural sensibilities, considering the context that we are debating in, right? So there is a qualifier that we're debating in a developing nation where probably the state deprioritizes certain aspects of, like, say, for example, pushing for socially progressive policies, right? So we really have to be strategic here as the LGBTQ plus movement, right? Considering this issue, government has to prove that despite, number one, pushback in status quo, because we are in a developing context, so presumably these are either conservative states or states that deprioritizes socially progressive policies like catering to the LGBTQ plus community, or two, scarcity of resources within that particular LGBTQ plus movement, because, you know, it's a conservative state, so probably they have less resources, they have less support, right? Government has to prove that despite these, this is the most strategic route for the movement to take, considering its incentives to, number one, provide a safe space for queer people in that developing state, right? So I already talked about how that actually has a lot of qualifiers, and my LO rather already have told you why that is actually a particular incentive for the movement. But number two, why you have to get buy-in, which is, I think, by and large, one particular issue in this debate, right? So which this would look like, you know, supporting the initiatives of that particular movement. So what did government say? They told us that, you know, in their counterfactual, we want to be able to we want to have ethnic minorities, queer people in these ethnic minorities, to be able to express themselves because, you know, it's intersectional, they are queer and they are also ethnic minorities. Number one, that is fair, but they have to prove that these priorities would be listened to in the first place. Notice how government's contribution works best in a frame where you have one ethnic minority versus an outsider, be it the West, or be it, you know, queer people from urban areas. Considering the characterization that ethnic minorities are already at a disadvantage, right, in terms of discourse, for example, in government's world, not only does the localized LGBTQ plus movement have to contend with the fact that they are gender minorities, they also have to contend with the fact that they are ethnic minorities. But I have to be very clear. Of course, we do want to support ethnic minorities, right? In an ideal world, that is both battles you can fight on. But you're in a developing nation. So in the actual world, you have to be strategic and maximize buy-in and being able to appeal to a wide variety of moderates and queer people. So probably we would hang rainbow flags and have showings of RuPaul's Drag Race, as opposed to having an exhibit about certain mythological figures that might be queer. B, I raised a POI. How does an outsider react to something niche in the first place? Like, you do not see a BGC gay person going to Baguio to research about local manifestations of queerness. They go there for their Instagram or for the content. Oftentimes, the nuances of local and indigenous identities will be taking a backseat. My constructives told you that this is because you are probably going to, one, less relate to these sensibilities and thus more likely to misinterpret them. And also, it is just way easier to exert effort to finding a third space or finding a picturesque background to shut a thirst trap in than actually educating your oneself at the localized traditions of that place. Number two, we question the extent of change inside government. We question the delta. Yes, they say you will not be able to be aware of one odd. First, I think that's a scale issue, but like the internet exists, the internet is there. But like, you know, look, let us analyze. In South Korea, right, who are likely to actually hear the voices of the marginalized, right? Those who either have a stake at it or are probably inclined to listen to them in the first place. So the educated, the scholars, right? Like JC Oboy, those who probably do research for policy lobbying. So we question government. So if that's the case, then even without their policy, there are probably people who are going to be interested. Then why are they trading off traditional methods of buy-in? So like, what is the delta? Before I move on to my third layer of response, sure.
So like queer people who visit for fun are probably so rich. If they are rich, that probably means that they have exhausted every inch of Thailand and Japan. If they are so tired of being in the same place, in the same tourism, isn't it more likely for them to look for something new and engaging, even if it's niche?
Number one, that is a mischaracterization, like rich, but you know, that's irrelevant, right? Assuming they are, right? Assuming they are. Like, they're probably going to go to that place to find the picturesque place where they can post the thirst traps. They're not going to, like, you know, oh, where's Wang Od? How, and like interview Wang Od about how many decades has she been doing the practice, or like, you know, research the manifestations of local queerness in that place. Like, you have to still analyze, why are these people going to be invested in these particular places? Because it's probably going to be likely, as what my constructives told you, that we are going to appeal to a wide variety of people if we don't actually, you know, take initiatives for this, you know, more niche cultural sensibilities. But the third layer of response then, what's in government's policy? Who will listen to them? At least unique nations such as the Philippines or Thailand this is what they said, can compete with Japan when it comes to queer tourism. That's the selling point thing coming from them. Like how? Like if I were to choose a place for my next thirst trap, I would not take into consideration the niche queer sensibilities of the place. But no, the government said the value is awareness. But JC told you, you go to a place and this responds soundly to their point that there is a selling point because you probably have an idea that Japan is the land of anime, of VTubers, of yaoi, of yuri. You probably are less interested about the niche queer cultural manifestations in northern Japan. But worse, on their side, you exoticize it. But what are the harms? A, you misinterpret. You can just say, I've already submerged myself in northern Japan. I'm probably more of a scholar that way. So you probably are going to be less likely to actually do research. Like that is an incentive mechanism that they have to prove still. B, the gaze is harmful. JC has been academically clear. Like you can really see that they are in their thesis phase. But it only means this. Government is compelling the LGBTQ movement to attract buy-in towards indigenous peoples. The problem of relying to outsiders for your voice to be heard is that you give the power to outsiders to define the voices, the sensibilities of the ethnic minority. So not only is this not the fight of the LGBTQ plus movement, the movement is sticking its hand in a cookie jar that does not belong to it in the first place. The movement becomes a pakaalamera. We would rather have the movement focus on traditional buy-ins because it wants to fight, against it being a gender minority instead of like fighting another battle of ethnic minority versus the majoritarian rule, right? We have this point of an act of resistance to the West, but JC already told you we have reclaimed it. We have localized versions of it. In contrast, we told you we're not sacrificing it because not everyone can be drawn to it. You get less buy-in for their tourism initiatives as compared to creating, so for example, a third space, for instance, in a particular locality where we hang rainbow flags, where you have an opportunity to mingle, as opposed to having an exhibit about, I don't know, some niche mythological figures. So like considering all of these instances, we oppose things. We win, yes.
Thank you, Opwip. On our versus speaking order, Op reply. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible and you're visible.
Wait lang. Sorry, me. Okay. Wait lang. Setting up my time. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing that I'll do is just take out Abed's extension, which they allege is important. Because there is no analytical connection of wanting to go to another place and wanting to learn from them. The subsequent effect of learning is not even marginally found in their side, even if they try to win this, nor is it ultimately enough to change structural issues that is needed for them to win that clash at all. More so, I would suggest that this extension is also contingent on the benevolence and the kind nature of these people who actually really authentically wants to learn or has like the long-lasting incentive for them to apply what they learn. So absent this particular like clarity and mechanization that comes from that extension, I just think that it's a wash. You can only then give Gov the win if you believe that you get buy-in and educate people to localize gay struggle. I think that you can't believe this simply because A, in LO's speech, we argued that the intention of foreigners and other tourist visitors is not inherently about being educated or knowing more about the culture. Most of the time, their primary goal is just to experience the particular culture and be entertained. So the benefit of increasing awareness is not effective insofar as the intention that is the prerequisite to secure effective and sustainable awareness are things that are devoid of the intentions of the visitors from the onset. But B, in DLO's speech, we extend this analysis by suggesting that the movement has more proximate and significant roles in prioritizing the feelings of inclusivity and community within members of that particular community, which becomes vague unless should we put premium in localized indigenous cultures and identities in our tourism, and potentially leads to infringing and infighting and internal division that derails the overall goals of helping the underrepresented inside Gov. I would note that they also never really truly respond to this. But see, in Whip's speech, we weighed this buy-in and suggest that it's not inherently good because of the external variables and factors that influence the education and awareness of the people to learn from these cultures. The fact that you remove commonality and a shared understanding suggests you ostracize certain identities that leads to more misrepresentation in their side. These three were among the most important things that we we brought to the table and argued why education and buy-in inside Gov are immaterial. But more importantly, I don't think that the most important frame in LO about why innate perniciousness of the tourism overshadows the progressive goals of the buy-in and education ultimately gets responded in their side. The best that we get from Gov is that these are rational actors. I would suggest that in my speech, we clarified why the group's rationality cannot unilaterally circumvent the variables and predetermine maliciousness and precarity of the design of the tourism in general, such as the innate interest of people to exploit local cultures or the oriental intentions of visitors who come from the West. The other clash that we focus on in PM's speech, but never really meaningfully rebuilt in other speakers of the GOV, is that they ultimately want to reject the Western hegemony and how the West ultimately created how we understand and feel the gay struggle. Throughout our speeches, we clarified why this is not the ultimate, why this is not important, why this is not the most important clash in the round, because in Victor's speech, we explain why the Western imposed gay experiences is innately still intersectional and common for everyone regardless, so there is still value should we try to focus on these particular experiences. For instance, in my speech, we argued that this Western imposition is far worse because the pivot of tourism towards indigenous local communities, for instance, or indigenous local communities, further side presupposes the Orientalist perceptions that only empowers the unbalanced dialectical tension between the gazer and the observed. So ultimately, they only appraise the West because of their innate power asymmetry. I want just to make this less convoluting and more of a non-scholar perspective. The way that we argue against Western hegemony is that should we focus on indigenous cultures, we only promote the feelings of fetishization and wanting to exoticize these particular experiences that are innate to the nature and the principled humanity of all people from the West, because of how their design and their sensibilities to humanity ultimately coalesce to that particular understanding. So at the point at which we allow them and give them the avenue to ultimately unilateralize their experiences and create a meaningful interpretation and description of our shared identities as a Filipino, for instance, that ultimately just gives them the power to objectify us and control the existing narratives altogether. Thanks.
Thank you, Op Reply. And to close this debate, and Gov Bench calling on Gov Reply. Here.
Hello. So, give us 5 seconds to prepare. Thank you.
Ayan, yan. Hi. Am I audible? Sorry, I think the other laptop got disconnected. Can I be heard?
Oops.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, you're audible and you're visible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, my other partner got disconnected. Terrible. Sorry, you know what? 3, 2, 1. Heartbreak is one thing, my ego's another. So please, opposition, you need to understand the intersectional struggle, especially from those in the fringes of the fringes, especially from indigenous people who have no tourism marketing to begin with. First Op's main case is to say that they prioritize diversification. So you don't want to focus on local and indigenous forms. Bro, no one here hates the colonial people. So the entire response from Op is just mitigation. None of it weighs any of our arguments. Note that because of the evolution from pre-colonial cultures, Prime proves quite clearly that these forms are inherent to the national identity. But because of the conquest of British invaders, these cultures were literally erased. You have Hijras who were burned when they talk about witchcraft because the British thought they were demonic rituals. Obviously, if you're dead or forced to hide in the mountains, you don't really persist up to the present unless opposition suddenly can bring back the dead to speak the truth that they weren't erased. Only government has ever engaged on the spectrum of cases, the multiplicity at which this debate operates on. Literally, people hate crime, the Hijras in India. They cannot go to anyone at all because they are marred entirely by the state. So LO was a bit distruthful when diversity does not equate to good public perception. The response is to say that people like Wang Od will be exploited, but we get no engagement on the comparative. On their side, there is no public buy-in for the Mambabatoks like Wang Od entirely because, girl, people don't even know her. Obviously, it's quite difficult for opposition to co-opt the benefits of tourism if you aren't even visible to the people in the first place. In fact, we get no mechanism tourism from LO, why this diversification is even crucial to their case. Note how the entire argument from LO was already preempted from my frame at Prime. We told you that these images have been erased because of colonization, because the West has the incentive to make their culture take precedence over indigenous ones. This is what led to the erasure of the Babaylans in the first place. LO attempts to respond, telling us that they are diverse anyway. Girl, this is mere assertion from LO. If that were true, then Drag Race Philippines Season 1 should have a diverse set of indigenous contestants, but quite literally, it was dominated by people from the capital, Manila, which means my argument on geographical insularship as Prime quite literally tells us that this necessitates they do not dominate right now. Diversification won't merit them to win. On opposition, there's a passive push to subjugate your indigenous identity simply because in the public's eyes, your existence is chaos that must be invisible. Notice that Theo weighs this quite beautifully, that invisibility and erasure is still far worse because opposition prefers to just erase your identity entirely, which is exactly what the West wants to happen. DLO says that the advantages of tourism derails the advocacy because of appropriation. What's crucial here is that Prime already framed, maybe quite well, how you get the economic ability for indigenous queers at the fringes. These are people who are inherently geographically isolated to begin with. The problem with DLO now is that they presume that focusing on them would mean less nuance. First, we prove that it doesn't matter because opposition doesn't engage with the comparative. Bingo, no buy-in entirely, so you get no tourism benefits on opposition, but also to, even if we accept but not concede, which is the worst case on our bench, that there is still reversibility. You can still call out precisely because you are talking about it. In op, we responded from Theo that people aren't talking about it, which means that you have no corrective mechanisms for when locals or white Texas just invade indigenous queers because they get no visibility. Public
Gov reply. Gov reply.
Quite conservative to do this. Opposition gives no proof how conservative people in Texas will. Conservatism is very oppressive. No, sorry.
Gov
It's
reply. It's 3:38. But
Yeah.
you kind of cut out for like a good 30 seconds. So that's like 3 minutes. Because can you try speaking? Because I think you're still quite laggy.
Oh, okay, I'll try to read the motion.
Oh, there. There are instances in which you start speaking really well or like moving really well based on the video, and then suddenly you start to lag out where you become no longer understandable. Can you try taking off your camera? I know it's
Okay.
I know it's like
Sorry.
the last minute of your reply speech, but like, you know, just for integrity purposes, of course, we want to be able to finish the reply speech and make sure that we heard everything.
Okay.
Can you try
Is
speaking
this
the
one?
motion?
Yeah,
Like
sure.
read the motion.
This house, as the LGBTQ movement in a developing country, would focus its queer tourism initiatives towards local and indigenous forms of queerness.
Yep, that's much clear.
All right. So
Okay.
last 1 minute.
Yes,
Oh,
last 1
sorry.
minute. You can resume
What
from
was
there.
the last thing that you heard?
You were talking about the discussion about hold on, where is it in my notes? You were talking about the urgency of these cultures and how your comparative essentially brings back these identities, or at least puts highlight on them.
Okay. Got it. Thanks so much. I'll be starting. So 1 minute left, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. DLO says that the advantages of tourism derails the advocacy because of appropriation. What's crucial here is that Prime already framed quite well how you get the economic ability for indigenous queers at the fringes. These are people who are inherently geographically isolated to begin with, which means that they don't reap the benefits of tourism absent this visibility and op. The problem with DLO is that they presume that focusing on them would mean less nuance. First, we prove that it doesn't matter because op doesn't engage with the comparative. There is no buy-in entirely, so you get no tourism benefits on op. But 2, even if we accept but not concede, which is the worst case on our bench, there is still reversibility. You can still call out precisely because you are talking about it. In opposition, we respond from Theo that people aren't talking about it, which which means that you have no corrective mechanisms for when white locals of Texas just invade the indigenous queers. They get no visibility, no public traction, obviously no support, because their intersectional struggles remain hidden in opposition. But we engage quite further because conservative places don't teach about LGBT, which means that tourism is the only feasible way for them to get any traction at all. Marketing exists on both sides, but now we tell the world how exotic and niche Uttar Pradesh is, which is what attracts the world to go there in the first place. Given that these are developing nations that are poor, the important question that fails to ask is where you get more people to be interested about them. It's not about empowerment that you get, because no visibility means no empowerment as well. You're empowered when people know about you. On opposition, you're responded heavily that you are unheard of. The traction can never be co-opted. At the very least, we accepted the trade-off. And even if you fetishize, at least these indigenous identities can live for another day. They get to eat food on their table. Very proud to propose this motion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, debaters. Thank you, Gov. Reply. To the debaters, please virtually cross the house. We will be back within 15 minutes. Please do not leave this breakout room. We will still give the OA and oral adjudication. To my fellow panelists, let's go to Discord room 29. So yeah, thanks. Okay, lovely. So both teams are present. This is what's going to happen. First, I'm going to release the decision, and then afterwards, we'll go through the oral adjudications. So the decision goes as follows. Regardless of whether or not I'm chair, both me and the trainee ended up voting this as a gov win. Again, it's a government bench win. So Ruel's going to give their OA first. I'm going to disconnect from audio. Once Ruel is done with their OA, you can chat me so I can reconnect to the Zoom audio. So yeah, thanks.
So hi, first let me confirm if I'm audible. Can someone? Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna start my OA in 3, 2, 1. So first my OA will go with the key points of the argumentations from both sides, the government and the opposition. Then the decision and the justification for the decision, and also some suggestions for this debate. So first is that for the cases that was provided by the government. The government has presented a compelling case for prioritizing indigenous forms of queerness in queer tourism initiatives, emphasizing the need to protect the vulnerable communities, challenge the Western hegemony, and protect more inclusive and authentic understanding of LGBTQ plus identities. So their arguments is about emphasizing the unique vulnerabilities faced by the indigenous queer individuals, such as discrimination, erasure, and lack of resources provided to them, especially by the government. Another thing is that they argue that the Western-centric queer tourism initiatives often reinforce the stereotyping and perpetuating colonial narratives. And also, the government advocated for the recognition and celebration of the indigenous queer identities, which often have been marginalized and overlooked, and also creating the importance of safe space for indigenous queer individuals within the tourism industry. Another thing is that they added the actors, which is the government, which is the role of the national actors, which is the government, in ensuring that queer tourism initiatives are conducted ethically and responsibly. And they also argue that involving national actors can help to prevent harmful practices and ensure that indigenous communities benefit these initiatives. Another thing is that the investors' interest. So the government noted that investors are increasingly interested in showcasing minority perspective and supporting sustainable tourism initiatives. And the last is the importance of providing proper representation for these indigenous queer communities. While the opposition presented a counter argument emphasizing that there is an importance of diversity and inclusivity, especially in queer tourism, they also argued that we should focus solely on if we focus on solely on indigenous forms of queerness, that could be detrimental to overall LGBTQ plus community and can lead to cultural appropriation and misrepresentation. So their key points of their arguments is that they are raising concern about the potential for cultural appropriation and misrepresentation of indigenous queer traditions that are often changed to cater the Western viewpoints of the traditions. Another is that they argued for a more inclusive approach to queer tourism, which could celebrate wide range of queer experiences and identities, and also the commercialization of the indigenous queer traditions and the potential of exploitation. So for the decision, in this debate, I think that the government has presented a more persuasive and compelling case, that their arguments are rooted in a deep understanding of unique challenges faced by the indigenous queer communities, especially those minorities, and the importance of protecting and promoting their identities. While the opposition raised valid concerns, the government's focus on vulnerability, cultural preservation, and challenging Western hegemony, and also the ethical involvement of national actors is more compelling. And lastly is for the suggestion. So while the government has presented a strong case, I think for this debate it is important to acknowledge that the issue of queer tourism is complex and multifaceted, and it is crucial to approach such initiatives with sensitivity, respect, and commitment to ensuring that the indigenous communities are empowered and benefit from those cases. With that, the decision is that the government win, and that's my OA for this round. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible? Can I just confirm?
Yes, Dipple.
Wait. Hold on. I'm gonna switch my audio and input device. Am I still audible now that I've switched?
Yep, you're still audible.
Okay, lovely. I'm gonna record my OA. Feel free to record my OA as well. I do not mind. That said, starting my OA in 3, 2, 1. Hi everyone, my name is Jill and I was your chair for this round. This is how my oral adjudication is going to go. First, I'm going to proceed to the decision and then afterwards go straight into my justification as for how I saw the debate and therefore led me to my said decision. So as you know, the decision goes as follows. It's a government bench win. How exactly did I arbitrate the debate that led me to said decision in the first place? I think there was one main issue, and this is particularly a discussion about representation of the indigenous queerness as an identity, or the indigenous queer identity for that matter. There are subclasses on this, which I will end up explaining eventually. But anyways, while it is compelling for opposition to discuss how at the point you have this queer tourism on on indigenous queer identities, you will have instances of misrepresentation, exoticism, fetishization of these cultures, how tourists, especially foreigners, and even own locals have a hard time understanding and comprehending these types of cultures, especially what more if you use this type of tourism. I think there's quite a few questions that are left standing despite the urgency and value of the harms that opposition pushes. The first question that I have is in terms of how exclusive and nuanced are these harms of misrepresentation towards indigenous queer tourism? Because the way that opposition tries to mechanize this discussion of harms is sourced from government's comparative is to talk about the structures of marketing and tourism and how those structures of marketing and tourism essentially dilute the authenticity of culture and the identities of these queer ethnic individuals. Because essentially, you make things like themed tours or tourist attractions and you don't properly get to represent these identities in a way that they should be represented, or that specifically highlight these nuances of culture and queerness from these ethnic
queer identities. But as a judge, I had questions. Why isn't this harm to why is this harm specifically nuanced or specifically only applicable towards indigenous queer tourism? Why doesn't it apply to queer tourism in general, given that the features and mechanisms of things like marketing and tourism are present in the general practice of queer tourism itself, which opposition themselves note are sources or reasons why there are instances in which identities will end up getting misrepresented. I think the question of nuance of this harm, at best, coming from opposition, is related towards how this misinterprets the added identity intersecting to queerness, which is the ethnic background. But at worst, it doesn't necessarily provide why these harms are exclusively to just that indigenous queer tourism. To judges, it sounds like a harm that is applicable to queer tourism as a whole, which ultimately limits the extent to which judges can credit the nuance of this harm. While I don't think government explicitly calls this out in terms of questioning whether or not the marketing harm is in and of itself nuanced or specific towards indigenous queer tourism as opposed to queer tourism as a whole, I do think that they still raise additional questions that make it difficult for judges to extensively buy into the opposition case regarding this, such as, this is the second level, how come measures and alternatives to mitigate these harms found in this type of queer tourism not enough? This is where government explains the reversibility of harms insofar as A, it is through the indigenous queer tourism that we get people, or local queer tourism, that we get people to buy the extension on, we get people to buy in, buy in, and by extension get that impact of critical mass where people participate or are aware of these indigenous queer identities or ethnic queer identities, serving as a mechanism to call out the harms that opposition notes are attached to this, such as opposition's discussion about how people are only going to these tourist sites or tourist packages to take selfies or thirst traps, not really caring about the history or the nuance towards these identities, essentially flagging to judges that there are more people coming from government's comparative. There are more people who are capacitated to call out these types of tourists or those that don't appreciate such cultures and identity when you opt into these types of queer tourism. I think the way that opposition ends up responding to this is by noting that this mechanism of call out exists regardless, essentially trying to symmetricize this impact or this mitigating mechanism that comes out from government, insofar as the people that usually engage in these cultures are the academics, the researchers, the people who study these types of ethnic identities, and as well as the queer identity. You have the internet essentially flagging that this is not an exclusive mechanism and questioning why it must be these other people who buy into this type of indigenous queer tourism. Well, I think that is a fair question that is posited coming from opposition. I think government's response to this was to say that the discussion was under discussion about extents, particularly about how you essentially just get more people to participate or more people to do it at the point in which they are more enamored to opt in or to buy into this type of queer tourism. I don't think Gov doesn't extensively disprove that academics or researchers exist, but instead agree and question to what extent are they able to reach a large amount of people, and to what degree do you get these indigenous queer identities known. While I don't think government explicitly pushes this to prove that this therefore means that you get a better or more effective call-out mechanisms to the harms that opposition notes, I think the extent of government being able to explain why more people participating leads to more people participating or leading to critical mass is at least sufficient for judges to understand that the amount of people that can end up calling out or that can end up participating in correcting these types of harms still exists, or at least isn't just limited to just those that exist in that research and academic space. But secondly, I think government is also able to add on to this in terms of being able to discuss the publicity or the knownness or the awareness of these types of ethnic and these ethnic queer identities. And this is where another subclash comes in, particularly about how exactly the ethnic queer identity ends up surviving, or at least ends up getting known and is aware by individuals. Because while it is compelling for opposition to talk about this discussion about misrepresentation and how at the point in which you end up highlighting these ethnic queer identities through this queer tourism, it leads to instances of fragmentation. I think as a judge, I had a question in terms of discussing like how exactly does fragmentation end up manifesting merely because you are highlighting this type of identity. At best, opposition is able to question that because you are highlighting these people, the other individuals within the movement feel like they're deprioritized. But at the point in which they feel like that, or at the point in which there is that extent of resentment or perhaps that feeling of deprioritization, why in that in of itself is a bad thing? I think, and the way that opposition tries to further substantiate or at least prove the value of that is because at the point you as a movement end up devaluing other members and therefore making your movement not as the safe space or not as the third space that it should be for its members who wanted safety in the first place. The way that government tries to respond to this, and I think this is more of an indirect response, insofar as they don't necessarily disprove this fragmentization that happens, but rather they end up trading it off by discussing who are the most vulnerable identities that exist within the movement, particularly discussing how when you are an ethnic queer identity, not only are you already someone that isn't as well known given the fact of your ethnic identity or given that you aren't as talked about or aren't as highlighted in status quo, but it is also the fact that one, either people don't understand you, given ops own mechanisms about how not even modern times or modern people, even the researchers still are trying to understand things like Babaylan. So there's a question of whether or not you're even capable of participating within that third space, or even a question of you being able to be seen in the space that is supposed to be for you, which is the safe space, or that is supposed to be the movement that opposition tries to defend, why it's important that we should not fragment this. So there's a question of, given the fact that this movement or this safe space that is supposed to be for you does not match your ideal, or at least does not already overshadows you with modernized queer identities, but doesn't necessarily put a highlight or doesn't necessarily consider or make space for the ethnic queer identity. There's a question that is posited in terms of who then gets to represent, or who then gets to represent, or who then is able to put a voice towards these ethnic queer identities or these ethnic queer individuals in the first place. And this is the push that government was trying to talk about when they're talking about awareness, not just in terms of getting public buy-in, but particularly about people being able to know that these identities exist in the first place, besides the modern queer identities that exist within the queer movement. The way that this was illustrated coming from Gov was the discussion about Wang Od, particularly about whether or not people actually knew her. The way that opposition tried to respond to this example and to this illustration was to say that people knew about Wang Od, we had researchers, we had people, we knew about it in the first place because of all these different discussions that happened on the internet, because of these academics. So it's not entirely clear how exactly these people or these ethnic queer identities are suddenly going to be invisible merely just because you don't have things like queer tourism. But I think the way that Gov tries to push this with the weighing is to weigh this on the extents, particularly on talking about how, to what degree did people know Wang Od, to what degree did people know Wang Od without that tourism issue that ended up happening in regards to her? And it's the same thing, or the parallel still applies when you're talking about things like ethnic queer identities, insofar as even if you know in history, even with things like academics existing and knowing the existence of Babaylans or the existence of these ethnic queer identities, there's a question of whether or not people are, the rest of the public, the rest of the majoritarian, or the rest of the people outside of just this niche community or outside of this movement are even are able to know or even value these types of identities. But secondly, I think even with the push that comes out from opposition to say that you leave these actors much more vulnerable to being misrepresented, much more vulnerable to have their identities being exoticized, I think government is at least still able to push this idea of there are already mitigating mechanisms in regards to this. The fact that we are already talking about this, the fact that we are talking about instances of Wang Od, or the instances in which the fact that more people participate means there's more capacity to call this out. I think if opposition wanted to be able to win on this discussion, and this is where I think about the tipping points about the debate, I think in order for opposition to be able to win this discussion or win this debate, it just needed to be clear as for what specifically were the features of indigenous queer tourism or ethnic queer tourism that makes it so exponentially harmful towards the ethnic communities or ethnic queer identities that they wanted to protect in the first place. Otherwise, it makes it difficult for judges to credit to what extent these harms are specifically nuanced to that alternative, as opposed to the existence of queer tourism, which will exist on both sides given the wording of the motion. But secondly, I think the way that government, and this is, I think, where government is able to tip the debate is, I think government is just much clearer in terms of being able to discuss how they mitigate the urgency of the harms or mitigate the harms that opposition is able to push are as urgent as valuable. So I want to be clear. I credit the extent to which opposition is clear in terms of discussing the value of the harms and the significance of why these harms are urgent. But I think government is at least able to point out and question that these harms are not as extensive as you think, insofar as there are already existing mechanisms and status quo that try to mitigate it. While I don't think government is as extensive in terms of proving the effectiveness of them actually being able to highlight or actually them being able to empower these ethnic queer identities, I think the discussion that government is at least able to provide is sufficient for judges to understand to what degree that they, one, at least provide some extent of platform for these ethnic queer identities, even if it comes at the expense of things like misrepresentation or the idea of things like fragmentization. Those things can at least be okay to be traded off, given that there is a more vulnerable actor that is more likely going to be forgotten or more likely going to be not as visible compared to other queer identities, and it's all the more important to place them to be visible at the point in which you have these indigenous these ethnic queer tourism alternative. But secondly, I think at least government is able to engage or at least weigh why these are more important to the movement or specifically towards the vulnerable actors of the movement in comparison to other members of the movement who might perceive this as a needed safe space or as a needed third space, but are not necessarily part of the ethnic queer identity or ethnic queer identities belonging to that movement. Overall, I think government is just much clearer in terms of the extent, or at least being able to mitigate the extent of harm that comes out from opposition. So for others is more, my decision stands, it's a gov bench win. Thanks.
Thank you for the OA. For personal comments, would it be all right for the chair if we ask it here?
Yes, I'd prefer actually that we do it through call. So yeah, I'm happy to do the personal feedback here. But if we're going to do personal feedback here, I'd prefer that you guys ask me questions so I can answer them and so that we can be more targeted in terms of providing feedback and by extension also being able to, you know, speed up the process of feedback. By the way, the recording is still ongoing. I don't know if you guys want to continue recording the feedback. I don't mind. But yes, oh boy.
Hi, sorry. So